Hi everybody, welcome to this lecture for week 4. This is interviewing. So today we're going to talk about what an interview is, the different types of interview, and advice for interviewers. So what is an interview? It's a formalised conversation between two parties in order to gather information. So it is, we can split that into two basic categories. The first is to collect information about a subject, with the interviewee being deemed an expert in something or someone with knowledge that the audience would be interested in. And the other rationale is that the person, the interviewee, their personality is of interest. So the interviewer must draw out the interviewee to be able to illustrate their personality. Sometimes there is a contradiction there, and sometimes there is tension. If the interviewee does not want to have their personality revealed, the interviewer must try and do that in a variety of ways. And you can do that in print quite easily. You can use descriptions around a person's mannerisms or the setting, or the way that the person interacts outside of the interview, the way that they might greet you, or the way that they interact with other people, or these sort of things, the way that they look, all this kind of stuff. So, but those are the two very broad differences, or two broad categories of an interview, and very often they cross over nowadays. We live in a world where the personal, the individual, what a personality is, and its motivations, in doing what it does, is as significant as the doing part. So we see this, we've seen this increasingly in politics over the last 50 years. There may be policies, and there may be directions, and there may be ideologies, but a lot of the discourse around particular people, and say politicians, for example, is what drives them, what motivates them, and what their personality is like. So why would we use an interview for doing this? Why don't we just say rely on people to provide their own testimony of themselves or their own autobiography? In news and journalism, for example, the interview is evidence of reportage. So if we can take the idea that a journalist is actually possibly is an invisible character, and they are a conduit for information, they're a conduit for creating a story, and the interviewees and their eyewitness testimony or their expert opinion or whatever goes through them and is filtered through the journalist, and then as part of the creating the story. We interview people to demonstrate that this story was not just made up. It was not just made up by the journalist. It has its basis in someone else's reality, someone else's work, and ideally or of course conventionally, what they do, what that story is about, is of interest to the audience and of interest to the public. For other media forms, the interview is a tool to gather expert information or a first-hand account that may contribute to the credibility and colour of a fictional work. So you use an interview not just to demonstrate that there is someone else in the story, but you use it to gather information. Again, take the idea of the journalist being a conduit, that journalists don't know everything, or writers don't know everything, so they gather information from other people, and then they can use that information to build their stories, to build their communication plans, to write their novels. So that's, again, they're very simple rationales. The reason why we interview is not a complex one, but it's good to think about those categories and to think about, when you go and embark on an interview, what is your purpose of doing this? What is the reason behind doing this? We have these on-screen and behind-the-screens interviews, and this is closely related to what we've just said. Sometimes interviews are media events of themselves. Watching two people talk or seeing or reading an interview between two experts is actually a really satisfying thing. Again, we might situate this within the concept of individualization. There may be a visceral pleasure or an intellectual pleasure in just watching, two people of similar intellectual credibility communicate to each other and elicit sort of information. And we also kind of enjoy rapport and all those sort of things. Or conversely, we may enjoy the conflict and tension between the two. It may be part of the performative aspect of what we're watching. And of course, that doesn't just extend to the visual. We can also situate that very much in the written form as well. And there are lots of cases of written interviews where there is tension between the interview subject and the writer or creator of the piece. And it's not just in a journalistic sense. Often in academic circles, you'll have two academic experts in interview or in discussion, or one interviewing the other. And it's, again, it's a very satisfying and engaging form of media because, you gain insights into this, I guess because it has a basis in conversation that you don't in other ways. And, we're getting into the realms of another philosophy here, but, the act of vocalizing things and having to communicate something from your brain to your mouth immediately rather than, say, your brain to a pen or a typewriter or some other form of media, is a different way of information delivery. Some may argue that it is less filtered, more truthful, more immediate. So that is part of the wider concept about why interviews are an engaging object. So, and other interviews are behind the scenes interviews, and we talked about those before. Those expert interviews, that these people that may not, that they may not be the subject of your story, but they're there to provide information. So some of these different types we've gone over this before, but we'll just reiterate it. So the research interview. The research interview is sometimes informal and perhaps carried out in order to get background information on a subject before another more important interview. So say you've been given a job of talking to a very significant artist. Very significant artist is about to have an exhibition at Mona, and this is a very exciting interview for you to do. But I imagine if you don't know yourself much about that artist, you'll probably want to gather as much information as you can about them. And of course, you can do that through research, through internet-based research, through academic research, and all those other things. But you can also interview people. You can also talk to people, and that again, as I said before, there may be you may garner different information through talking to people than you would through texts. They're different objects. All these different things, whether it's speech, academic work, journalism work, all those sort of things, they're all quite different. They may be about the same subject, but they all come at it from a slightly different angle, and that's really important to know. If you want a full, rounded view of of a subject, don't just stick to one type of research source. There's the key player interview, so the interview with a main spokesman on a subject. The main spokesman may be a cabinet minister or a CEO or the coach of a football team rather than a player. Those sort of people, and those interviews, of course, give credibility and gravitas to the story. Sometimes they might not have the insights that people at a coalface might have about a subject, but they demonstrate that these key players are that you're not going to just one level of governance for the story. You're going to others. So again, you don't just want to go to the key players. You want to go to all sorts of players if you can, or all sorts of people on a subject if you can. But it's interesting because, of course, in the last 40 or 50 years, organisations employ communications people as the main media people. So they will have a particular line of which they will provide to media and provide to people who want interviews, and they will often be the interview and have their name attached to it, and they will represent, I suppose, the official line of that organisation. But the key player is a slightly different person. The key player is the political or institutional head. So, again, the CEO or someone like that. So, they're quite different. So, a key player will have greater gravitas than the communications person. The eyewitness interview, that's the third one there, adds credibility and colour. And that's a reasonably obvious detail. I guess we have that sense that someone who sees something, there is a truthfulness in what they see, but there is a tension and a contradiction too, because you can have 5 eyewitnesses to the same event and they may have slightly different stories. The way that the public interpret an eyewitness interview is reasonably sophisticated, and when you watch that, when you watch an eyewitness interview, I think there's an innate knowledge that although there is credibility in their authenticity, it is probably not the objective truth, and the objective truth might be too difficult to actually comprehend or even come to in any capacity. So there are quite significant philosophical issues around the eyewitness interview and its place and its role, but they certainly add colour to anything you can do. And if you're writing something, sometimes they're a good place to start or end a feature story. You may be doing a story on conservation and conservation initiatives in the west coast of Tasmania or something like this, and it may, you may be interviewing biologists and political leaders and leisure groups and business groups and that sort of thing. But you may want to start off with a person who's a bushwalker, who's been in the bush and is just giving you an eyewitness account of the majesty of the bush and how much they really loved it and they wanted to see it preserved. And that, of course, that is a real creating that sense of identification with the audience, or hoping to. The expert, we've talked about that before. So it can be an extension of the key player interview or to provide useful background information. We're seeing the expert interview quite a bit at the moment with the COVID-19 crisis. The relationship between the expert and the interviewer is a reasonably complex one. I mean, the expert can, in this day and age, can just give their information out to the public through their own channels. But of course, there is so much information out there, it has the risk of getting lost. And that's why you're seeing quite a lot of reliance on the mainstream media right now, because it's really important to maximize the audience. But in doing that, the expert needs to realize that their information is going through the gatekeeping of the media. So, there is a particular tension there. And when we have really important things like what we're going through now, where there's really important information about people's particular safety and their habits and their culture and all that sort of thing, there's a huge level of responsibility on both the expert and the interviewers to, I guess, to interpret the information in its best possible way. I think that should be a maxim all the time, but in times like this, it becomes even more significant. And then the profile. And we talked about this at the beginning when we talked about the individualization and gaining insights into people. The profile is an interview particularly for that reason. The interview has no information delivery purpose. It's there just to paint a portrait of a significant person or of a person. So they can be in two types. Interview arranged by the journalist or the writer with the subject, or the kind of the celebrity junket interview where there is a sort of a where they're actually trying to promote something. So there are kind of, I guess, there are two broad things. They cross over a lot, but they are there just about the individual person. I'm just going to show you a little clip. This is very old now, but it's from one of my most beloved profile interviews. This is an interview with the late British playwright Dennis Potter, who died in the mid-90s, with Melvyn Bragg, who's a really celebrated British arts journalist and writer. And I always like to use this clip because Potter does mention Rupert Murdoch, and it just shows that Murdoch's reach and his, I guess, the particular people's relationship and opinion of Murdoch has been around for quite a long time.
That's an interesting thing. As a writer, you will know that one of the favourite fantasy plots of a writer is a character's told, you've got 3 months to live, which is what I was told. And you, who would you kill? Because you've got and I call my cancer, the main one, the pancreas one, I call it Rupert, so I can get close to it, because that man, Murdoch, is the one who, if I had the time, in fact, I've got too much writing to do and I haven't got the energy, but I would shoot the bugger if I could. There is no one person more responsible for the pollution of what was already a fairly polluted press. And the pollution of the British press is an important part of the pollution of British political life. And it's an important part of the cynicism and misperception of our own realities that is destroying so much of our political discourse. And that is what is happening. And look what's happening at the BBC. Look what is happening to television in general. Look who owns it. The arguments done by respectable liberal commentators, liberal small L commentators, about size, the economies of scale and so on, they're all actually nonsense. A program costs what a program costs to make. It can be made by a tiny company. What they're talking about is ownership of the means of communications. And they're talking about the mass media, as J.B. Priestley coined the phrase. They're talking about political control in the end. They're talking, how can we have a mature democracy when newspapers and television, whether standard television, cable television, are beginning to be so interlaced in ownership terms? Where are our freedoms to be guaranteed? Who is going to guarantee them? Well, and the series, you can punch the buttons in the predictability. You can call the shop numbers out in advance. The formula-ridden television is because of sales, because the nerve they'll soon have, where they'll tell every 5 seconds who's switching off. The pressure upon creators, whether they're writers, directors, designers, actors, producers, whatever, that pressure will be all the time to maximize your audience at any given point, which is the very antithesis of discovering something you didn't know. It's the very antithesis of the kind of broadcasting and television which was such a glory in British life.
Each little tear and sorrow only brings you closer to me. Just wait until
I find that a very interesting clip, and of course some things have changed. Television has broadened out a lot. With streaming, and I think there's a multiplicity of possibilities for new voices, and of course, digital communication has allowed for, minute budgets to produce and broadcast and disseminate their work. But some things haven't changed either. So I do revisit that clip every now and again, and it fills me with mixed emotion. But you can watch the whole interview, which is about, I think, 30 or 40 minutes long. I think that's available on YouTube as well, and well worth seeing. I will say that everything is political, and profiles. The profile interview is this weirdly political beast, and if you look at American politics now, things like the late night talk shows have become very strong political fora. Even if they don't have those sort of figures on them, they the political figures, I mean, they do they do represent this very interesting narrative of left and right, of Republican and Democrat. This doesn't really exist so much in this country, and possibly in other countries, but it's really interesting to do. But the point is, if you're going to profile and do, most profiles are going to be soft. I would possibly suggest they would certainly begin that way, because most people, whatever their position, if they're going to be profiled, I imagine they would want to be seen in a reasonably sympathetic light, and they would want to use it as an opportunity to, like Dennis Potter before, to give their opinions and to have their thoughts and feelings exposed. So in the lead up to the 2016 presidential elections, this politicization of the late night shows was heating up, and Jimmy Fallon was the only late night guy that got Trump on, and he was widely criticized for going very, very soft on Trump. And of course, the late night shows, if you know them, like Colbert and Seth Meyers and I think Conan O'Brien and all those, that they're reasonably anti-Trump. And now, of course, Jimmy Fallon is he's quite critical of Trump as well. But he was the only one who was given this opportunity, and he was widely criticised for going too soft on him. We will watch this clip.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Donald Trump. Donald, I want to ask you, because the next time I see you could be the president of the United States. I just wanted to know if there's something we could do that's just not presidential, really, or something that we can do now that we're just both civilians. Like
what? This is... I'm not liking the sound of this. Go ahead.
Can I mess your hair up? I'll be gentle.
The answer is yes, but the people in New Hampshire, where I'm going to be in about an hour from now, I hope they're going to understand. Okay?
You say yes?
Go ahead with my hairspray.
So you can see that was that was very gentle. It was very playful, and of course, was quite celebratory of Trump and what his personality, and showed him in a very positive light. Not all the interviews, and a lot of the interviews that students and more inexperienced interviewers do is not with significant people, not with famous people, not with the CEOs and the experts. It's with the eyewitnesses, and it's also with vulnerable people. And this applies very much to journalistic type projects and projects like what you're doing here, but also in other forms of your studies, especially if you go into postgraduate work and that sort of thing. A lot of researchers around people who are marginalised or vulnerable, or a similar kind of category like this. So we've talked a lot about those more kind of celebrity type things and experts and that kind of stuff. But you've also got to remember, and I did touch on this before, that to interview someone and to have them to create a profile for them that will go out into the public, has a strong level of responsibility, carries a very big level of responsibility. And as a writer, as a creator, you need to really be aware of that. So when you're interviewing vulnerable people, you just need to think about particular things, and these apply to interviewing anyone, but especially in this instance. So you must ensure that you have consent, okay, and things like images and photographs and audio recordings and all those sort of things. Never take that kind of stuff for granted. You must make sure that they have support if they need it, a support person. You need to be courteous and respectful. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute when we talk about the practicalities of interviewing, because interviewing for you as the interviewer can be quite a stressful thing. It can be quite a challenging thing, and certainly involves a lot of multitasking. And you can be so preoccupied with things like, is my tape recorder working? Is my phone battery full? Is my camera working? And all those kind of things. Just to you might forget just to put your subject at ease and to be courteous and those kind of things. But for the person being interviewed, it's really, really important. The next thing is to get advice and prepare thoroughly. And research is just such a significant part of interviewing. Just knowing what you're talking about, asking questions that are relevant and credible is massively important. Be careful with the language you use. Be careful. That's part of research. So, if you're interviewing someone who is just, been in a conflict zone or something like that, you don't use metaphors or similes that have war or conflict connotations. It may be problematic for those people, or it may bring up bad memories. So you have to be really, really careful of this interaction. I said right at the beginning of this lecture that it is it's a formalized conversation, and it is a formalized conversation, but it's one that you need to really think about constantly. You need to think about not only the information that is being asked and received, and if it's being recorded, and if all those practicalities are doing, but realize that it is a weird dynamic between two parties, and there can be vastly different power imbalances between the two. Make sure that the people that you're interviewing know the reason for the interview and where the interview might appear. That if you work for a little newspaper or something, and you might be published 5 stories a week, it may be nothing to you to publish stories, but for them it will be a big event, and they'll be might tell their family, look, I'm going to appear in the local online press, or I'm going to be on the local television station or something like this, and it's a big deal. So be mindful of that too. And also, it's a really good idea. It sort of depends on a few factors, including where you work, including who your subject is, and including the different type of forum and form of interview, but to give your interview subjects the opportunity to review their quotes. That doesn't mean letting people see your finished copy and give consent to the finished copy. no writers should ever do that, but to just review their quotes and to make sure that what you're publishing, what the words that they're saying that you're publishing are ones that they remember saying. They may try to, have a bit of revisionist history on this and say, I didn't say that, but that's where you have recordings and that sort of thing, and you can say that. But, it's so that people don't feel that they've been taken out of context and all that sort of thing. And we'll talk more about this in a sec. These are just a few points on how to interview. Interviewing is so different for everybody. Everybody does it differently. Everybody has their own, their own approach. Because as I mentioned, if it is a conversation, everybody has their own style of social discourse. So an interview is no different. There's no definitive way to interview someone. There's no definitive style of conversation or being. These are just some tips. And I think I put some of this type of material on the Padlet this week as well, so we can discuss it there also. So make sure you do lots of planning, okay? Remember to really research your subject. So depending on the interview, you may have spoken to, you may have had time to get some background. But if you haven't, always remember the W's, the whys, whats, who's, whens, and wheres. They're a really good place to start. Ideally you will have something more than that, especially if it's a slightly more complex issue. But just have those things planned out, at least those W's planned out, and have them written down. Who are you? What do you do? Why is this happening? Why are we doing this? Where is what happened, and those sort of things. But planning, which is slightly different to research, but planning and research are really, really important. Understanding your subject, get to know what your interview is about. Okay, so why are you talking to this person? You may have scored a great interview with I don't know, a policymaker or something like this, but has there been something going on recently? And this is where we have that idea of newsworthiness. It doesn't need to be, when I say that, it doesn't mean to be just in the journalistic sense, but is there something that is going on that your audience, whoever your audience is, are they going to respond to? So that's an important thing. You might have a fantastic interview with a great subject, but if there is no relevance at this moment or when it is published, then it's not going to be as successful. To write notes. Okay, when I studied journalism, we were really strongly dissuaded from using tape recorders, and I learned to do shorthand, which is pretty archaic now, and I can still do it a little bit, but it was really, really hard. But it was quite good for lots of reasons, especially if you're in daily news, because listening and redrafting from a recording is really time consuming. So just to have notes is quite good. But just writing notes is for lots of reasons. Firstly, it's quite good to have a prop. If you're interviewing someone, it's quite nice to have something in your hand, and having a pen in your hand. It just, I don't know. I mean, that's an individual thing. I quite like having it there as a prop. But it's good to have at the beginning to draft an outline of where you want the interview to go and what angle you want to take. So you might have a list of questions, but then you might want to just swap the order around. And instead of just trying to remember that or trying to think about it, just have it written down. And those sort of things, which will really kind of help you. Deciding on the point of the interview, this is sort of a bit like what we said before. Why is the interview happening? Why are you speaking to this person? And what is the public interest? Write both general and specific questions. Not all the questions and not all the answers and not all the copy. If you're writing, and remember this is a writing unit, so it will be written down. If it's a written interview rather than a staged interview or a broadcast interview that's going live, you can take out or leave in questions as you see fit. So you can do that. So you can ask lots and lots of questions. It doesn't matter. You can ask 30 questions if you want to. So really general questions, I don't know, why do you do what you do, or something like that, which can elicit really good answers. Like really big open questions can elicit really, really big answers, and really interesting ones. And then specific questions about the minutiae of what they're doing is it's important. Again, these, I want these points to just be kind of guidelines. And before you do embark on an interview, I'd be really interested to see what questions you come up with, and what order you come up with them, because we all do it differently, and it's all in our interpretation. So write open questions as well. So never write a question that may encourage a yes or no answer. Are you happy with your latest music? Okay. Are you happy with your latest album? Yes, is a lot different to what is it about your latest album that you're happy with? Okay, it's a semantic choice. It's the way that you, I guess, the way you articulate a question. Write questions tailored to the planned length of the interview. You can't say to an interview subject, it might take 20 minutes and it might take an hour. You need to actually be quite directive when you're organising an interview, and say, well, it's going to be 30 minutes long, and we're going to be at this place, or you choose a location or whatever. But you need particular questions. So if you have a nice long period of time, like 30 minutes is quite long, you can ask big, wider questions that may have more rambling answers. But if you say you've only got 5 minutes, and if you look at those, and they're just terrible. I really dislike looking at them, but they are a genre. Those junket interviews with movie stars who are promoting a film, and they get 5 minutes or something. Each journalist gets 5 minutes with the with the star, and they have to ask these very kind of sharp questions, and they often try to kind of elicit something interesting in the question, which is usually backfires terribly, because the movie star who has done so much press has heard all the questions before. Listen and respond. This is really, really, really important. You need to think about what is being said. And as I said before, interviews interviews do work on this interesting sort of problematic dynamic, where there is often an imbalance in age and status, or of kind of all these different I guess economic and social and demographic differences between the interviewer and the interviewee. And that can change over time, and the interviewer becomes the person with greater gravitas than the interviewee. But probably when you're starting off in your media career, or you're just at university, the imbalance is the other way. And because of this, if you're in that situation, the interviewee will try and kind of railroad the interview in some capacity, to make themselves look better, to get their point across more strongly, and to kind of, I guess, neutralize any kind of critique that you might want to pin on them. It's really important that the interviewer listens and doesn't get too carried away by that power imbalance. And it's really, really difficult. But of course, as the interviewer, this is your gig. You are in charge of this. You are the one who has organized this. You're the one who will be writing the finished thing. You're in control of it. And it's really important to listen as well as ask questions. And this is possibly, arguably, the most challenging thing. And as I said at the beginning of this lecture, interviewing is a very multifaceted thing to do. There's lots of practical and, I guess, intellectual things that are going on at the one time. And sometimes the interviewer can get so caught up in trying to make sure that the practicalities are being sorted out, they forget to listen to the questions being asked. To the responses being given to the questions. And sometimes the answers to the questions might be quite different to what the initial question was asking for, but it may elicit a really, really fascinating response of which you've got to, you as the interviewer, you need to respond to and quickly change your line of questioning to accommodate that and to gain more information about that. But it is a very, very difficult thing, and more often than not, so many people have done it. So many journalists have done it. Have done an interview, have gone back and listened to the transcript and have heard your interviewee say something really incredible, and you haven't really picked up on it at the time. You've just gone straight to the next question and gone, oh, okay, blah, blah, blah. And then gone, oh, I wish I'd asked that question about that thing. And you could possibly go back to them and say, can I ask you this question again? But the moment might have been gone. The moment might have been gone. Interviews are this particular moment in time, and you've got to be kind of on your on your game at that moment. Print interviews are great. They're really good. And as I said earlier, there's lots of scope for creativity within this. You can do them in lots of different ways. You can you can create the tone. They're a very creative object. The feature story and the interview within the feature story is beautifully creative, and there are so many great examples. And I keep thinking and I keep reading them and go, oh look, I must post that onto the 160 Milo page so people can read it. But if I did that for everything that I find interesting and inspiring, then you guys would be inundated with this information, and you probably wouldn't have time to read it all. But they're really good, and a good, well-written feature is an absolute work of art. And here's just an example of one that I really, really like from Bill Zemmy's 1990 Rolling Stone interview with Warren Beatty. And in this interview this feature story is really, really famous. And Bill Zemmy, Warren Beatty was really famous at the time because he was having a relationship with Madonna, and he was always known as this really difficult interview subject, this terrible interview subject. And Bill Zemmy just, instead of just writing it straight, he did it in the style. So he didn't want to say, oh look, Warren Beatty was just really awful, and I really disliked interviewing him. And he was really evasive and difficult. He instead wrote it in this Q&A sort of way, with these moments where he stated how long the pause was between Warren Beatty's words and sentences, and the gaps between the sentences, which is really, really effective, because it's not saying, Warren Beatty was really annoying and we sat there in silence and it was really awkward and problematic for the whole time, but he's just doing it in this beautiful economy. Think of that stuff that we did in our first week with George Orwell, and that line he had about, if you can cut a word out, cut a word out. I love that, and I love the notions of efficiency, and this is a very efficient feature which tells you so much about its subject. It probably says more about Warren Beatty than any other interview that's ever been published about him, but it's also the most economical. So I think that's a really great example. So, okay, right, so a few practicalities. Right, don't spend too long on one interview if you only need one quote, okay? If you're doing a big story about, some wide-ranging thing, I always use the example of energy policy because it's so complex and I know nothing about energy policy. But, you say you need 10 experts' opinion on something, and including the CEO of Tas Power and all these different people. You might get on the phone to someone and they might want to talk to you for half an hour. You don't do that. As I said, this is about power. There's a lot of power dynamics going on. And that's the case, you just want to get one quote and you've got it, and you say goodbye. Okay, make sure you get the right expert, and this is important at the moment. And with the COVID-19 thing. There are a lot of people who are who are experts who are providing opinions. There's a lot of health ministers and public health officers and all those kind of things. I mean, we have to rely on the media in this instance to make sure that the people that they're putting up in front of us are the right people who have the right knowledge. There's an element of trust going on there. But so it's very important that you have the right expert for that job. Make sure your tech is working. I mean, it doesn't need to be much more description, but it's really important. And I had a couple of terrible stories to tell you, terrible anecdotes about when tech failed on me, and it was very embarrassing. And one time I had to go back and do an interview again. Make sure the interview setting is right, so not too loud or not too quiet, but also, if possible, on neutral territory or on your own territory. If you're finally got an interview with, a really senior business figure, they'll say, "Oh, I'm too busy to go anywhere else. So you're going to have to interview me on my office," and you go into this, oak-lined office, and it'd be very intimidating. So you're very much in their territory, in their space, and therefore the power dynamic is already created. Make sure you're on time. Make sure the day is correct. Again, I have a horror story about that, but I won't go into it right now. Suffice to say, I was a day late for a series of interviews, which wasn't great. And make sure you're dressed appropriately. Okay. I think people are much more savvy about that nowadays. I think people know, how to dress and be respectful of other cultures and be respectful of other situations and dynamics. But yeah. Well, that's it for this lecture. I hope you can engage with it, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see how we go in the future with more lectures.